Hi everybody, I'm Ravi. Susie's written a fantastic book called Freedom to Think. It's scary, enlightening, but also optimistic, and I hope we can cover quite a lot of the ground in it now. And it's also ever more relevant. So in the last year, I think all the themes in this book have become ever more true. So really worth a read. Now, let's start with what is freedom of thought? When I picked up this book, I thought, I think I know what that means, but the more I read, the more I realized actually it needed more definition, and also, how is it actually treated in the law today? Is it actually part of our human rights fabric?
Yeah, I mean, freedom of thought to me is a sort of really interesting concept that when I first studied philosophy, I thought a lot about freedom of thought, but I hadn't really thought of it as a legal concept. And then despite working for 20 years in law and human rights law in particular, I had a moment, a sort of epiphany in 2017 when I first read about Cambridge Analytica, when people were talking about data protection and privacy, and I thought, actually, this is about freedom of thought. But in all those years, I'd never thought about freedom of thought as a right. But it is a right. It's a human right which is set down in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is 75 years old today. So we've had a right to freedom of thought for at least 75 years. It's also in international conventions like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and in the UK it's part of the Human Rights Act. So the right is there in law, but it had been pretty much never used. And when I started to research it and look at how it could be used, the main reason I could see for that was that lawyers seem to have said, and judges as well, well, of course we have an absolute right to freedom of thought, but no government can get inside your head anyway, so it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if that was ever the case, what I talk about in the book is looking at the ways technology has been developed, that whether or not it's snake oil, a lot of technological development is precisely about trying to get inside our heads. So we have this right in human rights law, domestically, internationally, and it has sort of two parts. So you hear a lot about freedom of expression and free speech around technology, particularly social media. And if you like, expression is when you're telling people what you think or telling people what you want them to think you think. But the inner aspect of freedom of thought is something that you sort of keep privately inside your head. So you may be thinking something completely different to what you're telling the world. But when we see, as I say, with Cambridge Analytica, this idea of behavioural micro-targeting, the idea is that the technology can tell people or make inferences about what you're thinking, what kind of person you are, what's going on, and then use it to manipulate you. Mm-hmm. And looking at the strands of what freedom of thought means, because it's pointless if it's just a philosophical concept. Mm-hmm. So, what does it mean in law? And it's got three primary threads. The first one is that no one can coerce you to reveal your thoughts. So you have the right to keep your thoughts private. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to that behavioural micro-targeting idea, that's about drawing inferences about your thoughts based on things that you may not realise you're expressing. So it's not based on what you've said on social media. It's based on your behaviour, if you like. And one of the drafters, the drafters of international human rights law, recognise that inferences could be a violation of your freedom of thought, even if they got you wrong. Mm-hmm. The second plank is freedom from manipulation. So nobody can manipulate your thoughts. You've got an absolute right to have your thoughts free from manipulation. Mm-hmm. And obviously we all influence each other. I mean, my career has been as an advocate or diplomat and a human rights lawyer. All of those jobs are about persuading people, influencing, making change. And that's fine. It's the question is, where's that line between influence and manipulation? And the third part is the right not to be penalized for your thoughts alone, which is crucial. And that goes back to the inferences kind of question. So if you think of a sort of historical example, if you're sitting in your village and the witch finder turns up and decides that the wart on your nose and the black cat at your hearth would indicate that you're probably a witch. Whether or not you've ever had a witchy thought in your life, you may still be burned at the stake for inferences about what you're thinking. So it doesn't have to get you right for it to be a violation of your freedom of thought. And I think those three elements really give us the sort of bedrock of what freedom of thought means in law and how it can be used and how it's relevant to technology today.
But as you said, we're all influenced by our parents, our peers, the marketing, the media we consume. So where is the threshold? What do we mean? What's enough freedom of thought, if you like?
It's a very big question, and it's a big question, I think, on all three planks. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And one of the things we've seen in the last 20 years, for example, about the right to private life, privacy, data protection, is there's been huge amounts of regulation, but also litigation that have started to establish what privacy means. If you'd asked someone 40 years ago what privacy meant, that also would have been a nebulous philosophical idea, and now it's something that's very concrete. Freedom of thought, we're very much at the start of that process. But one of the things that you can look at as an example is subliminal advertising. So subliminal advertising is this idea that you could flash images so fast at someone that they wouldn't know that they'd seen them, wouldn't disturb their movie watching experience, but they would then go out and buy whatever cola you had flashed the image of during their movie. Now, European governments saw that this was such a potentially dangerous tool. I guess they were still reeling in the aftermath of the sort of mind control and propaganda of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, that they immediately said, whoa, this has got to be illegal. This just can never happen. So while that ban was not expressed in the terms of freedom of thought, it is effectively, it's a practical protection of freedom of thought to say, sorry, subliminal advertising is manipulative, and therefore you can put your billboards on the street, but you can't ever use subliminal advertising. And in Europe, that's been the case for decades now. And so that's an example, I think, of where you can see one side's okay advertising about influencing the general public, the other is about bypassing people's critical faculties.
Right. So as part of Nesta, I think, as you know, we also have the behavioural insights team, the nudge unit that started off in number 10 and then spun out. And obviously one of the basic tenets of behavioural science is that the choice architecture that we see is always influencing us. And also it's very, very hard to have a very neutral environment. So to give you the obvious example on pensions, the default option used to be that you don't opt into a pension. Now the default is you are opted in. Even if you think about something like obesity and walking through a supermarket, that's one of our missions at Nesta. And obviously the way in which things are promoted, the way the store is laid out, is consciously designed to cue you into buying certain things. So it's very hard to conceive of setting up that food environment in a neutral way. It can either be pro-health or pro-certain products. So isn't the truth that we are always being manipulated, whether it's by companies, by the media, by politicians? So is it a rather sort of quixotic concept, if you like, freedom of thought?
I don't think it is. I think there is a line. Where that line is will be very fact and context specific. And it's been one of the challenges when I talk about this, is that people always say that, effectively. Aren't we all being manipulated? One of the things, if you look in a sort of analog environment, that I think in the past 5 years in the UK, we've introduced a crime of coercive control. Coercive control is something which was about influence and potentially control has become in a domestic environment to a stage where it's clearly manipulation and therefore it's a criminal offence. And I think the same goes whether you're talking about, influencing the public in supermarket shopping, if you like. It's about how you get to make sure that people still have choices, while obviously influencing and persuading in ways that we hope will benefit people. But I think it's always going to be very context specific. The advertising case, I think, is a really useful one, because, again, as I said, subliminal advertising, it's just banned. I think the way behavioural advertising works online, this idea that we're then profiled in quite micro details, potentially as well in real time, about how we're thinking and feeling, and that information is then being used to target us as individuals with products that may or may not be good for us. to me, it's almost like the boiling frog situation that you got from saying, well, isn't it great that you can reach out to audiences that are interested in your product to actually, oh, here's someone who's vulnerable, that we know they're vulnerable at this precise minute because of what they're looking at and because of their activity in the past 2 hours. And therefore, we're going to hit them with a gambling website that will tell them that gambling will make them feel better. Those are very different things, but it's sort of the boiling frog process where you start off with, isn't this great? You can reach new audiences to, here you go, we can actually manipulate people into buying stuff on a sort of individualized profile basis without them knowing that this is what's happening.
But I guess, so one example I was involved in of sort of precision nudging, if you like, was in Jordan, helping Syrian refugees get into work. And one of the things we did was try to understand what will work for who and create a sort of precision nudge to sort of help Syrian refugees get into work. And it depended on their particular characteristics, where they lived, their aspirations, and some things like testimonials would work for some people, other things would work for others. Now, in your mind, is that okay to basically sort of increase the likelihood that someone gets a job, which is what they want, it's their aspiration, but we are manipulating them in a way?
I would say that example is probably at the more problematic end. And again, it's because of the personalization. And because that personalization can be used to get someone into a job or to stop someone going for a job. And it's that personalization which I think is the real problematic question. And so it also depends how far down the personalization track you're going. And that's what I say with the behavioral advertising. If what you're saying is about this person likes camping because they're on a camping website, so let's show them a tent, that's great. If what you're saying is, this person wants to compete with their next door neighbors because they're highly competitive, they haven't got any money, but they could get credit, so we're going to show them a really fancy camper van, while we're showing the next door neighbor something a bit more rubbish because they're never going to put their hand in their pocket, even if they've got more money, that then becomes very problematic. And that's based on this granular knowledge of people's personalities. So I think the mining of that is where the problem comes. It's not about what you want to do with it. It's the process, if you like, of mining and making these profiles, which is problematic. Even if you're doing it for good reasons, because that can be twisted very, very quickly.
Well, the book talks about all the historical examples of freedom of thought being sort of overridden, if you like. Propaganda is a great example. But when you think about the current state of technology, and even since you wrote the book, things have changed quite a lot in the last year. Just paint a picture about how severe the threat is to our freedom of thought based on current technology, because it feels qualitatively different to the kind of historical examples you cite in your book.
I think it's really acute right now. So, as you say, I looked at historical examples, but the more I read about technology from this sort of starting point, the more I realized that almost all of the direction of travel is about this profiling and personalizing. How do we understand how people think on an individual basis, and how do we then use that to change them? Big questions about consent. So again, manipulation. If you walk into a hypnotist's office in order to have hypnotherapy that you're consenting to, and they do what you've asked them to do, that's not manipulation. If they hypnotize you as you happen to be walking through the shopping center and get you to do something ridiculous, then that is manipulation. So a lot of it is sort of about consent and understanding. But there are so many things, whether it is, the way facial recognition is used. Facial recognition, emotion recognition, it's no longer just about identifying that you're you in this place. It's about you're you. Are you a potential terrorist? Are you a potential shoplifter? Are you thinking about shoplifting right now? All of those things are making inferences about your inner life, which will then have huge consequences for the rest of your life, effectively you potentially being penalized, particularly in the criminal justice sector. Again, when you look back at history, there's sort of this idea of physiognomy that you can read people's faces. Charles Darwin was nearly excluded from the Beagle because he had the wrong kind of nose, and the captain wasn't convinced that he was the right, he was going to have the moral fiber needed for the journey. You see technologists claiming that they can identify criminality in children just from a facial photograph. That then potentially means those children are damned for life, whether or not they ever would have become criminals.
Yeah.
Same with researchers who claim that they can tell your sexual orientation from your face. And again, it's like, it was headlines, the virtual gaydar. Whether or not that's correct, that technology could well be deployed at a border near you when you're traveling. You might then find yourself discussing with the border guard that, no, the technology got your sexual orientation wrong, but you're in a country where that could mean you're going to be put to death. Yeah. So we see it sort of, things where reading our faces has become so normalized and often is harvested, whether it's from dating apps or from people using apps to see, what you'd look like when you're older. Things that appear to be fun can then be turned very quickly. And we see it with also sort of our ability to think and our critical faculties. You talk about, what's happened in the last year. If you look at something like ChatGPT, and everyone's saying, isn't this great? It can, it can write your essay for you. It can, solve so many problems. But if you look at the impact, for example, at Google Maps, there's been research that shows that Google Maps has literally changed the formation of people's brains so that we don't have the same spatial awareness that we potentially had when we were finding our own way around the world. It's literally prevented us from being able to think in ways that we used to think because we rely on it. If you rely on ChatGPT to write everything for you, you're going to lose your ability effectively to think for yourself, because you're just going to be looking at saying, this is clever, this looks good, I don't need to think anymore. And we've seen it already with lawyers in the US. There was a big story about a lawyer who presented pleadings in court written by ChatGPT with 6 fake cases. And when the judge and the opposition said, we can't find these cases, they doubled down and went back and said to ChatGPT, are these really real cases? And ChatGPT said, yeah, they're definitely really real. They're found in really, really reliable sources. And then it wrote the judgments. So the lawyers came back in and gave fake judgments to the court because they hadn't done their research. They'd kind of forgotten how to go to a law library and actually check the law. And I think this is a real risk of manipulation, but sort of by convenience, if you like, that we sort of think, this is good, this is clever, we'll just do that instead.
I mean, one of the ways in which I've used ChatGPT, though, is to almost do the opposite, where, sometimes you tend to utter cliches and say the obvious thing that everyone else says. Sometimes what I might do is ask for the ChatGPT 1,000-word article that I would have written, and then make sure that I'm actually adding some distinctive value and not allowing the sort of the words just to be chosen by someone else. So on that theme, though, are there ways in which we can use technology or other mechanisms to help people calibrate and think for themselves? So sometimes I think we do pre-bunking experiments where we really try to help people think and deliberate before making a choice.
I think there are real opportunities, and I think the big question for technology is, what do we actually need? And so if you're looking at a problem, what is the actual problem? And one of the ways of finding that out is to actually ask the people who've got the problem, and also, talk to people about what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, but also what they need. And so, as well as the lawyer, when you actually look at why they use ChatGPT, it was because their law firm didn't have access to the proper legal directories because they hadn't paid their dues in order to get access to the federal level resources. All they actually needed was proper legal research tools. They didn't need ChatGPT. When you see as well as in judges in Pakistan using ChatGPT in an experiment to decide on bail for a 13-year-old child. I mean, they said that they made the decision before they played with ChatGPT. But looking at that, you're like, okay, the Pakistani judge is writing a judgment in English because that's the language of the court in Pakistan. It won't be his mother tongue. It won't be the child's mother tongue. It won't be anyone else in the court's mother tongue. So actually, what do they need? Well, useful legal resources, and actually potentially to be able to write the judgment in your mother tongue and then have it translated by, so maybe a translator is actually what you need. It's not ChatGPT. So I think it's about understanding what's the problem you're trying to address. How do you do that in a practical way, rather than having this idea that You have to have all-purpose AI, all-purpose technology.
But do you think, let's imagine a scary world in the future where one of the members of your jury is an AI, and you do that because you actually think that having an AI in the conversation with jurors will actually improve the quality of the discussion and challenge bias, and you deliberately try to do that? I mean, do you not think there are ways in which technology, given that we are riddled with biases and inadequacies in how we think, couldn't AI actually help us become better at deliberation, particularly collectively?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think maybe having an AI that poses questions rather than an AI that provides answers could be one of the ways of doing that. And I mean, the bias question, I think, is a little bit of a trap that, for me, I did the classic, which sort of everyone on my LinkedIn profile was doing, is, ask, can you write a bio of Susie Alegre? And I was told I don't exist. So I wasn't sure if that was better or worse than the people I saw who died on ChatGPT, but I didn't exist. So then when I asked who wrote my book, I got 20 answers. All of them, bar one, were men. Some of the men didn't even exist according to Google. They were just random men because surely a woman wouldn't have thought about writing about a profound question like freedom of thought. The only woman that came up, which I think shows as well how it works, was a woman called Bobby Stevens. So she could have been a man squared because both her names were men's names. And presumably that's why she got through the filter to be one of the people who'd potentially written this book. How you de-bias data, I think, is a really massive, massive question. And then there's another question of, is it worth it? When you think about the sort of environmental cost of running AI, why exactly are you doing it? And I think that's the real question, is that when you're looking at new technology to fix problems, you need to understand what the sort of cost is in lots of different directions and talk to the people who need it to understand what it is they really need.
And I mean, you said in the book that we've been a bit complacent about freedom of thought, but there are actually some interesting examples of how this field is evolving right now, and good examples of a bit of a fight back. So, what are the things? What are the seeds of hope that you see?
Well, when I first started looking at this, the idea of saying that behavioral advertising should be banned was just ridiculous. Although I thought it, I would never have said it in 2017. I was, maybe we can talk about political behavioral microtargeting and banning that because people were very outraged. But what we've seen last year, I wrote sort of my predictions for 2023 in the wired world were that we would begin to see the end of behavioral microtargeting advertising. And in the first week of 2023, the European Data Protection Board said that Meta's business model of targeted advertising is illegal in Europe. Meta's still fighting that decision in the courts, but it was, within a week of 2023, the regulators had started saying, actually, no.
On what basis?
Pardon?
On what basis was it illegal?
Based around GDPR, and so the fact that the behavioral microtargeting and sort of behavioral advertising, Meta's business model of effectively gathering all this data, profiling you and using it to manipulate you, if you like, or to target you with advertising, is not compliant with GDPR. So it's not, again, a freedom of thought argument, but it's effectively doing the same thing. And what we've seen this summer is that in Norway, they've announced, their data protection authority has announced that Meta's business model is illegal in Norway. And so they've basically banned it. They've given them 3 months to try and come up with a way to make their model lawful, with then daily massive fines for failing to comply. So we are seeing a shift, and I'm not really sure how Meta is going to demonstrate that it can be lawful and still be profitable with the same business model. So things are starting to change. And even last year, President Biden in the US said, we're going to stop targeted advertising to children. If you stop targeted advertising to children, it's going to be very, very hard to keep it switched on for adults. And there's also a big policy question of, if it's so terrible for children, why have their parents being manipulated? How is that good for children? And so seeing that in the US, I mean, I didn't dream that the US would be talking about that at this stage. So I think there is hope, and I think if you start talking about those things, then there's course correction and the ability to rethink what our technological future looks like, to have the people who are creating new technology, thinking about human rights, thinking about the implications for freedom of thought, and creating and innovating in ways that will do that. And I think the other thing that for me is a signal of hope was that, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, talking to Stanford, he said this has got to change, because if we had lived with all of these distractions and surveillance back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, Silicon Valley could not exist, because you can't have innovation in this environment. So I think when you see technologists starting to recognize that this technological environment is a risk to technological innovation itself, then you're going to start seeing people thinking in a different way, thinking in a different direction.
So I want to turn to sort of solutions in the last 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, one, if you were a tech company boss, what would you be doing if you'd read this book? I mean, apart from probably completely changing the business model of many of them.
Well, I would be talking to people who know about human rights, people who know about societal impacts. I would be making sure that I have them in the room, whether it's, in closed spaces, finding safe spaces to be able to discuss this stuff so that you can decide which direction you're going in, some things that you may not develop further, to think about it both in terms of, the future of the society that you and your children are going to live in, the society that you're going to leave, the legacy that you're going to leave, but also future compliance risks. Because as I say, we may not have had cases on freedom of thought yet, but I suspect they're coming down the pipeline. I mean, there's been one so far in Spain about political behaviour or micro-targeting, but I think there will be more. So, talk to the people outside of your bubble, understand what the challenges are going to be in a way that doesn't have to wait for scary headlines. And don't believe your own hype. Be prepared to be questioned. And it's one of the challenges as a human rights lawyer. You sort of feel like you walk into a room and you're raining on everyone's parade, and it's like, actually what you're doing is planning the parade so that people don't get washed away in a flash flood, or that there are umbrellas and that there are guardrails, if you like, which is the buzzword for what you need. So I think having the courage to have those conversations, and you can have those conversations quietly, and there are lots of people who would love to be, I would love to be having those conversations with the people who are doing the innovation at the start, or with big companies, to kind of think, what's the next stage? How do we course correct? What should we be doing? If you want to ignore the advice, you can ignore it down the line, but I would take that advice first.
So work. So and if you put yourself in the shoes of government leaders, people making institutions, what are the kind of 2 or 3 things that you think they can do next?
I would think, look at the institutions you already have, and maybe fund them properly, and make sure that you allow them to be independent. If you want to know where the legal guardrails are, give people access to justice to challenge things in court. If you want to know what the human rights implications are, fund and provide independence to human rights institutions and give them the powers, which is what happened in Spain. It was the Spanish Defensor del Pueblo that brought the challenge to law to the Constitutional Court. So
there's enough in there in terms of existing law and existing organisations, if well supported, to try and evolve this framework?
I think that there is. I think there may be add-ons that you need. There may be additional things. What you don't need is some global AI regulatory superpower. That is a distraction. That is a way of saying, oh, we've got nothing. Right. But actually we have got stuff. It's just not properly funded. It's difficult for people to access. So I would look at what you've got and allow that to develop to meet the challenges.
Well, we could talk for a long, long time. We don't have any time left, but it's great to chat. And thanks very much for writing an amazing book.
Thank you.
Thank you.